What up, y'all? So it looks like there are some changes in the metagame now. Thank goodness. The card changes seem to have affected the metagame a little bit more than I anticipated. So interestingly enough, there are only two decks in the top tier now, according to the HSReplay data. Obviously, there's a couple different websites that do this stuff, but I'm gonna go over some of the changes as well as kind of how I interpret some of this data, because figuring out what the best deck in the metagame is sometimes is very easy, sometimes is very hard. The best deck normally a little easier to figure out than the right deck to play, because those are two different things. Sometimes the best deck is not always the right deck because there are so many people trying to take on the best deck that it creates like shifts in the metagame because that's the best deck. I've seen that happen a lot, where if deck A is the best deck, then deck B and C will start to adapt to that, and then eventually deck B becomes the top deck. And then as deck B is there, deck A and deck C have to adapt, and then maybe deck A or deck C become the best one in the meta, and that every time that shift happens, the metagame shifts to adjust to it. So really interesting stuff. I love this aspect of metagaming and like finding the holes and the adaptations and how the innovations happen based on what's the most dominant. So let's get into some of this stuff here. So I use HSReplay. And again, there's many different ways you can look at this. So if you have a website you prefer in terms of data, by all means use it. This is just the one that I like the most. Very easy interface, works out very well. So right now, the top two decks, according to the data since the card changes, are Herald Shaman and Aura Paladin. I was very surprised by Aura Paladin, but one thing worth noting is the number of matches. So 110,000 matches at 58%, that says a lot. That's obviously very strong data. 20,000 at 57%, much weaker data. It's a good win rate, but 20,000 that's about a fifth of the number of matches. That's really, really a significantly smaller number. So that is worth taking into account. I wouldn't be surprised if Aura Paladin gets pushed back down into the B tier because other decks adapt to the metagame, kind of like I was talking about with deck A, B, and C. But we'll definitely see how that plays out. I have a feeling that some of the Warrior decks are the most likely to adapt because Warrior has some very powerful tools. And I've mentioned this a million times before, finding the right combination of cards when you have good tools is normally just the key from breaking from tier B into tier A. Sometimes, you just find those like 2 or 3 different cards that kind of shift the momentum or the tempo or all these different aspects of deck building can change something so rapidly in just a couple of days. So, but I wanted to get into Herald Shaman. So after these card changes, it was Skywall Sentinel and Flight of the Firehawk that changed. This was a 0/3. Flight of the Firehawk gave the minions +2/+2 instead of 1. Those don't seem to have made too much of a difference in this deck at all. Obviously, there's a little bit of a lowering of power level here. However, it doesn't matter. This is very obviously the best deck in the format by far. The match, like I was saying, 58% at 110,000, that's huge. Like, this is huge data that says this is just dominantly the top deck in the format. Now, I think part of what Aura Paladin's prevalence is coming from is the aggressive nature of a deck like Herald Shaman, because Aura Paladin has some very effective ways to just clear out a board between Scale Breaker, Manifested Time Waste, stuff like that, and that's very good against a deck like Herald Shaman. So these two are kind of battling it out because I think they're essentially polar opposites. And Aura Paladin also is seeing a lot more innovation. You're seeing people actually test different combinations of cards, and you're like, oh, this one could actually be good. Like, it makes me very happy to see Bubble Paladin down here working its way slowly up in the B tier. Very interesting deck, definitely worth checking out. But as far as Herald Shaman goes, I think it's really important to know what the best deck is playing at each iteration. So for a while, they were playing Flight of the Firehawk, and there was that 4-mana spell. They gave you 3 different minions, as well as Cloud Strider. The guy that's 3 mana, 4/3, whenever it dies, you play a spell that you put on top of him. So that guy was fine, but he was a little kind of situational. He would sit in your hand a lot, so it wasn't conducive with being an aggressive deck like Herald Shaman wants to be. So seeing now that we're playing Lightning Storm in the majority of Herald Shaman decks and a single Hex means that they are prepared for a lot more different situations. I think the Lightning Storms help the mirror matches because this deck is so popular that, I mean, it is 93% of all shaman decks. It's basically the only shaman deck. And then if you go over here, this is the metagame by matchup. So Herald Shaman is 12% of all of the decks in the format right now. So that's that's pretty crazy. That's pretty popular. Well, I'll get into more of this later, but the popularity of decks will help you figure out deck selection as well. So, but understanding what the big bad boogeyman in the format is, you got to be able to at least be semi-competitive against this if you're going to be playing something, whether you're doing a legend run or you're trying to just get better at the game, figure out a hole in the metagame, anything like that. But otherwise, this deck is essentially all the same. I like that we're now playing Apprentice and Twilight Egg. I think this is a really interesting combination, but I am of the opinion that these get a little bit worse when Flight of the Firehawk only gives them +1/+1. Because before the card changes, you could go Flight of the Firehawk, and then on turn 3 after you play it, just play a 0-mana 2/3 with Taunt that gives you another spell. Just super, super crazy good. Now it's a 1/2, which is still good for 0 mana. Free is best, but Twilight Egg being a 1/3 instead of a 2/4 is a little bit worse. So it's like, it is what it is, but I think it makes these aspects of the deck a little bit worse. I think Witch's Apprentice is probably going to stick around because being able to throw a little taunt guy out there between this and Skywall Sentinel, I think that gives you some good ways to kind of protect your board. If your opponent's like, well, I play this minion and I'm going to try and attack through, then, having something to put in the way is a very simple strategy to just continue bashing face while they figure out how to get through. But yeah, this is essentially Shaman. It's a very straightforward deck. I like it. I think it's powerful, but I'm not sure this is the deck I want to be playing yet. This is part of why I'm doing this video, because I'm in the middle of a legend run, and now that the card changes have taken place and we've got a couple days of data of those changes in the metagame, I'd like to figure out the best deck for me to be playing at this point. So other thing to take a look at is the best matchup is Evolve Shaman, which is the other, small percentage of Shaman decks. That makes sense. Evolve Shaman is not a deck in my opinion. Worst matchup is Face Hunter. This is very interesting. So they've got a 46% win rate against Face Hunter. Now, it may be worth looking at the Face Hunter stats here. Like they've got a decent Herald Rogue matchup. They've got, of the most popular decks here. So I usually go till somewhere about here, around 3-ish% to really take a heavy weight of the win rates. But if you look at Face Hunter, it's like 54% with Herald Shaman. The other tier A deck is Aura Paladin, which they have a 42% win rate against, so that's not very good against the top 2 decks. It's essentially 50-50, or a little bit lower than 50-50 if you average those out. But then the rest of these, there's a lot of red. So Herald Death Knight, nope, just kidding. There we go, Face Hunter. Then we go here, and there's, a lot of red in here. 64% against Herald Rogue is pretty interesting, because 64 is a very high number. That's a really high percentage. But otherwise, it's a lot of 44, 48, 47. So just based on that information alone, I don't know that I can justify Face Hunter as a deck selection for me. But if you want to just, fingers crossed, try and make it through, that's cool. I always say on a legend run especially, you usually, in my experience, want to start with something aggressive, get a good win rate going, and then once you get into like the high platinums or the diamond rank, that's when you kind of change it up to something that has more specific matchup benefits. So I don't know that Herald Shaman is the best deck to play there. I might end up going Herald Shaman just because it's the most consistent and very obviously a good deck as I get into the high diamond tier. But I'm very tempted by Aura Paladin. So Aura Paladin, I played against it a lot so far on my legend run. I think I've done 3 different parts of that video series so far. It usually takes me about 7 or 8 videos, which is somewhere between 10 and 15 hours total. But I've played against a surprising amount of Aura Paladin, and they've done all right. It's been kind of mixed. I was playing Imbue Druid and Unholy Death Knight, so very aggressive decks. But every now and then I would just get blown out by Aura Paladin. Like the right timing on Scalebreaker, Renewing Flames, especially off of Ursol, as well as sometimes Spearheart will give you something like Consecration, or just, a very, very right time, right place kind of spell. And Manifested Timeways, also really powerful in the early game because they've got 4 ways to get Acceleration Aura, just Raw or Treasure Gill. So the odds of them having Timeways on turn 3, 4, or 5 is still pretty high, which is pretty good against Herald Shaman, obviously, like I've mentioned before, but it's also good against a variety of other aggro decks. So if we look at some of the other things in Tier B to get an idea of like what am I also going to be playing against, I need to keep these in mind the most. But the next deck, aggro, Herald Warrior, also a little aggro, Dragon Warrior, pretty aggro, Bubble Paladin, kind of mid-rangey. It's essentially just an aura deck with some different pieces. Spell Demon Hunter, kind of mid-rangey with some explosive elements. Face Hunter, aggro, Aggro Druid, Imbue Druid, aggro. Egg Warrior, combo control. Herald Rogue, kind of mid-rangey, combo-y, kind of control-y, very interesting strategy, but this is where we start getting into the 51 and below percenters, which is not really something that you care that much about. This one hurts my heart. Arena Warrior at 51%, that was so much higher a couple days ago. So you really only want to go, down to about 52 or 53% at the most to really take into account what we're playing against. So we want something that's got, good matchup here, as well as taking into account some of these decks down to about Face Hunter. I don't think anybody's going to be playing Aggro Druid at this particular time, or even Imbue Druid. It's possible. You'll see some randos every now and then on the ladder, but I think a lot of people are going to be like, forget this, I'm out. And also keep in mind, just from a value perspective, whenever they nerf a card, they give you full value when you dust it. So there are probably people that are like, I'm dusting this stuff to get the most value, and I'll always come back to Druid at some point when I want to. But getting that dust usually is a difficult value proposition to not take. So we want to have good aggro matchups between Herald Shaman and Death Knight, as well as Herald, Dragon Warrior, and Face Hunter. So that's already pushing us towards Aura Paladin, or maybe even Bubble Paladin. Yeah, it's kind of hard not to play something that's got some good aggro matchups. So what you could do also, this is one of the other reasons I like HSReplay, is you can select which specific decks you want to be taken into account in the estimated win rate. So if I want to, if I don't care about Imbue Druid, here, let's see. So we want Herald Shaman, Aura Paladin, and then these guys down to about Face Hunter. I'm just going to kind of ignore Druid. So Face Hunter, Spell Demon Hunter, Bubble Paladin, 2 Warrior decks, and Death Knight. So we can just take out essentially everything. Rogue is not in there. So I almost want to take Rogue into account, but I'm not going to at this moment. Herald, Death Knight, we don't need. Face Hunter, yes. Spell Demon Hunter, Arena Warrior, don't care. And we can quite literally just get rid of a bunch of these. Unholy Death Knight we do want. And then once you get down here into like the decks that are less than 2% popularity, it usually doesn't matter anyway. As you can see, I've already X'd out a ton of these. We don't need this. That's actually amazing. Look at that. Just all green. Blood Death Knight is just dead. It's just the worst matchups across the board. And then kaboom. So we can take into account Unholy Death Knight, Aura Paladin, Spell Demon Hunter, Face Hunter, Herald Warrior, and Herald Shaman. The only thing I don't see that I would like is Dragon Warrior. There it is. And I believe, let's double check, I believe that's pretty much everything we care about. Bubble Paladin is also a factor in here. Make sure we've got that one. Bubble Paladin. But Bubble Paladin and Dragon Warrior very low on the popularity level here, so that's worth noting. So first thing, with just those matchups that I'm thinking about taking into account, what has the best win rate here? So immediately we've got Spell Demon Hunter. That's fascinating. So it's probably got decent aggro matchups because of cards like Broxigar's Last Stand, Infestation. They've also got Axe of Cenarius, which has lifesteal. There's like these elements that are good against aggro. So that's definitely worth considering. They've also got, so Aura Paladin, 54% is very interesting. Unholy Death Knight, 51%. So if we're going by the numbers, 54 is probably the highest percentage. Yeah, nothing else here matters. So 54 is really the highest percentage. That says Aura Paladin. So if you're just going to go by the numbers, you're going to be playing Aura Paladin and have the most possibility of doing well with the decks that we are expecting to play against. Next up would be Spell Demon Hunter. I think in this situation, I'm going to start with Aura Paladin and then maybe play Spell Demon Hunter. I think Spell Demon Hunter would be more fun to play. Aura Paladin kind of feels like, well, I'm going by the numbers, and the deck's got a little bit less play to it, in my opinion, whereas Spell Demon Hunter, I feel like there's a lot more nuance and a lot more, I don't know, variability in your play. So, you know, your play style can change the way that a deck plays, but only if that deck has the ability to change because of your play style. And I think Spell Demon Hunter is an example of that, whereas Aura Paladin is like, you play the cards at the right time, and it's pretty objective when the right time to play those cards are. You know, Manifested Timeways, Scale Breaker, stuff like that. They're just huge, massive cards. Like just yesterday, I was playing my Legend run, and I was playing, like I said, Unholy Aggro. And while I was playing it, my opponent played Manifested Timeways, and I think they killed like 1 minion. And I was sitting there going, that seems like a humongous waste of a resource. And the reason they played it, I think, is because their acceleration aura was going to lapse the beginning of their next turn, so they couldn't do it next turn. Well, in that situation, I think it's objectively correct to not do it just for the sake of doing it, because the value you can get later with that is so high. Also, the next turn, I think I played... what is it called? Swarm Guard. I played the Swarm Guard, which is like 3 mana for 3/1, or 4 mana for 3/1/3s. So I was just like, literally the next turn I played something that this would have been amazing against. And obviously because of the acceleration aura lapsing, he couldn't play it that turn. But just the idea that you could then hold that for later, I think, is the objectively correct play. And so with a deck like Aura Paladin, it's like, you don't do stuff like that. You play it by the book, you get the most value possible. Spell Demon Hunter, there's a little bit more play. You're discovering stuff. You're drawing cards. When you draw cards, when you discover things, how you play against your opponent, what you play around. Way more nuance of play. So those are some of the factors I take into account when considering decks, and this is essentially how I come to the conclusion on what to play. Now, if neither of these work, Spell Demon Hunter or Aura Paladin, and I don't make enough progress in order to get higher on the ladder towards Legend, then I may just pull out Herald Shaman. That might just be the way to go. But I'm going to pull up Spell Demon Hunter here. 53%, not a super crazy win rate, but reasonable enough. Over 50% is reasonable. 60% is usually like the nuts, so it's the way it goes. But this is the most popular version of this deck. And it's all pretty much things that look to be pretty standard. One I-Beam is interesting. I think that shows you the prevalence of aggro decks, and that's a good example of what I was talking about at the very beginning with deck A, B, and C. Your deck adapts to play things like I-Beam when aggro is super heavy, so now this gives you better aggro matchups, and from there, maybe the metagame shifts, and so once it's not as aggressive, I-Beam gets cut, things start moving around in terms of win rates. I love metagames. It's so interesting the way that things adapt like this. And then this is the one with the highest win rate. So we go from 53% to 58%, about half the games for the highest win rate though, so definitely worth considering. The data is a little less. But this one is 1 hive map instead of 2. That's worth noting. Otherwise, yeah, so one of the hive maps is gone and the I-Beam is gone, and that means they've got another card which looks like, is it Sigil? No, they've got Sigil. And yeah, this is what a lot of deck building tends to be. You're like going back and forth between, okay, what do they have in here? What do they have in here? What do they have in here? Horn of Feasting, Hounds of Fury, so Horn of Feasting. Horn of Feasting is the thing that's in the higher win rate deck, which makes sense. Horn of Feasting, really good against aggro decks, so this is probably the version of the deck that I would end up playing. I think Horn of Feasting is much better than I-Beam if we're trying to specifically cater to the aggro decks and make sure those matchups are good. So that's pretty much how this goes. So I appreciate you guys watching. Definitely check out the other videos on the channel. I do like to break down the metagame like this and get into some of the details and the stats, but I also just play play as many decks as possible to try to show you guys, you know, how good is this deck? How do you play this deck? You know, what matters? What things are you trying to play around when you're playing specific decks? Because this stuff's important, figuring out like, okay, when's the right time to play X, Y, and Z deck? But it's also pretty important to know how to play the deck. Who would have thought? So past that, definitely check out the other videos. If you're already following the channel, big thank you. I appreciate you guys. Let me know in the comments what you think the best deck in the format is, if you think I missed it here. This is according to the numbers, and this is the thing about the numbers. Last thing I'll say here. The numbers don't lie, but the numbers are also from the past. So the numbers will tell you exactly what yesterday's best deck will be. Sometimes you do that, and then today it is not the best deck anymore because the metagame is already adapting and shifting. So this is why I kind of come up with an ABC plan. I'm like, okay, I'm going to probably start with Aura Paladin, then go to Spell Demon Hunter, and then if that doesn't work, go to Herald Shaman, because that gives me like a tiered plan for like, okay, you know, if the metagame is shifting even more so, I still have a way to get through that and figure out the best thing to do in any particular situation. And I think that's what the best players end up doing, is having that obviously preparation, knowing what the best thing is according to numbers, according to research and data, but also in the moment taking that preparation and being able to figure out with, you know, minute-to-minute problem solving, how am I going to use all of this information right now to make the best decision? Not just deciding, you know, before what the best decision is and then just playing it out. That's not, you know, how the professional players end up doing this. Sometimes in the minute you have to change up the plan and know when it's appropriate to change up the plan, and then to figure out how to change up the plan. So preparation important, problem solving important, gameplay important. There are all these different aspects, and they all come together to make the perfect player. So thanks for watching, guys. I appreciate you. Peace and love.